Welcome to Policy and Governance Perspectives, the official podcast of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. Join Dr. David Ramadan and Schar School experts as they engage in thought-provoking conversations with elected officials, policymakers, and thought leaders. Listen for in-depth discussions on policies, politics, governance, and career pathways, all designed to elevate your perspectives and expand your mind.
Welcome, listeners, to Policy and Governance Perspective, the official podcast of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. We are recording this episode on October 3rd in the middle of a federal government shutdown. And although this episode will not air until October 15, there is still lots to be covered. My co-host today is my colleague, Dr. Jeremy Mayer. Jerry is a professor in the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University and director of the Master's and PhD program in Political Science. He has published on topics such as presidential politics, public opinion, ideology, and higher education. In this episode, he brings deep institutional knowledge of U.S. political institutions and a scholarly perspective on the stresses that shutdowns place on governance. And our guest today is Steve Ellis. Steve is president of Taxpayers for Common Sense, a nonpartisan federal budget watchdog that monitors government spending, debt, and fiscal policy. Mr. Ellis has testified before Congress, been a visible voice in media debates on federal spending, and consistently advocates for fiscal accountability. His perspectives is grounded in practical concerns about budget process, shutdown risks, and the impact on government functions. Welcome, gentlemen.
Great to be with you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Jerry, why don't you lead us with perhaps an overall education on what causes a shutdown?
Great. Well, a shutdown is when the government fails to pass all or part of the federal budget, which is usually divided into 13 component parts. They have to pass those bills by October 1st, or the parts that are unfunded legally have to shut down. Now, a shutdown doesn't mean the government completely stops working. By law, activities that are vital to the preservation of life or government property have to continue. And so in some departments, that could be as much as 60 or 70% of the workforce, and others that might be 5%. And ultimately, historically, everyone gets paid when the shutdown ends. But if it goes on long enough, people can be working a month or more and not getting a paycheck, which can be a stress on many family finances. Shutdowns usually end with a continuing resolution rather than a full budget. They end with the government agreeing to stay open for 3 or 4 more weeks while the Congress tries to pass a bill that the president will sign that will fund the government for the remainder of the year.
Thank you. Steve, you have quite a bit of experience with these. This is not the first shutdown that we see. And we have seen one that lasted up to 34 days during President Trump's first term. Where do we go now?
Well, David, you're right. This isn't my first rodeo and certainly not my first shutdown. I've been at Taxpayers for Common Sense since 1999. And so there have been several during that time frame. And then even before that, when I was an officer in the Coast Guard, I was in the issue of whether it was going to be essential or accepted employee or not. So I certainly had that experience on that end as well. And so these shutdowns, it's both sides are pretty dug in, as opposed to most times where you feel like one is in the past, for instance, like you mentioned, the one during President Trump's first tenure, actually 2, but and one that was kind of broken up. But there you had active cheerleaders for the shutdown in the Republican Party, and that was part of the cause. Here, they seem to be mostly all on the same page of being that it's just the Democrats' fault. Nobody's saying that we should shut down government, with a little bit of an exception that I can get to later. And whereas the Democrats are also saying that they should not be shut down. And so both of them see, and they think that both of them have their base with them. So at the very moment, they're both pretty entrenched. At some point, things are going to give, and it's really a question of exactly when, whether that's in a week. I don't think it'll be any sooner than that, or in 2 weeks when this podcast airs.
Jerry, I know you had a couple thoughts and questions for Steve. Go ahead.
So I'm just curious how, as someone from a nonpartisan group that has friends on both sides of the aisle and is rigidly non-polarized, right? I mean, I think that's one of the best things about your group is that you don't engage in the personal attacks and the bitter politics of the day. Where do you see the blame game? Who is at fault this shutdown in your view?
Well, I'm certainly in the pox on both of their houses camp to some extent, and that is this has been something that we've seen coming for a long time. And you mentioned at the top, Jerry, about how there's a 13 spending bills, but not this time. We've been operating on a continuing resolution for the entire fiscal year 2025, and
And I think you should explain to our listeners what a continuing resolution. I know I tried, but I think you could probably say it more succinctly.
Well, basically, if there's 13 bills, or no, 12 bills, sorry, are not completed in time before the beginning of the fiscal year, then whichever parts of the government don't have a spending bill. So, I mean, they're divided into, and sometimes it looks kind of weird. It's like, you have transportation, housing, and urban development in one bill. You have Veterans Affairs and military construction in another one. So you have these kind of hodgepodge of agencies that are put together. I believe FDA is in the USDA bill. But anyway, essentially the parts that don't have a full year appropriation, you'll enact a continuing resolution to cover them, to keep them operating during that time period until it expires. And what happened was earlier in the fiscal year, there was a continuing resolution during the Biden administration. And then they passed another one that continued into the Trump administration into March, but they still couldn't come to agreement on what to do. So they passed a full year continuing resolution until the end of the fiscal year, September 30th. And that's the first time that the entire government has been operating under a continuing resolution. And a continuing resolution is really limiting because you're basically dealing with what you passed last year. It's just extending the spending that was done for fiscal year 2024 into 2025. Now, there are what they call anomalies, and these are sort of the adjustments that are made. So, for instance, in 2024, there was funding for the inauguration. Well, in the continuing resolution, at least the one done in March, they pulled that funding out because obviously we didn't have to spend any money on building the grandstand and everything else along with inauguration. Those are the anomalies. So anyway, but the point is that the entire government, including Department of Defense, which is really the one that it has not happened to before, is operating a continuing resolution, which is very limiting as far as planning, as far as executing. There's going to be waste. There's things that should have been paid, that should have probably gotten more money in fiscal year 2025 than it did in 2024, less money in 2025, but it's all the way across the board. It's a really terrible way to run government.
I couldn't agree more. And what I tell my students is a shutdown is like, in medical terminology, an induced coma. You're taking the government and you're saying, all right, we're going to do something that's really bad for you, but we have to do it. And what I think of a continuing resolution, I think of it as the government giving itself chemotherapy. It's really, really bad for agencies to go through a CR for a month, let alone an entire year, because all of your planning, all the negotiations you went back and forth with your authorizing committee and your appropriation committee and OMB, all of that's out the window now. And you did all that work and all those plans. It's not going to happen. You're going to try and do this year on last year's budget, which is a really dumb way to run anything. You wouldn't do this to your family, let alone an agency of the federal government. So we could debate about who's responsible for the shutdown. But for my money, it is a failure of the Republican Party under Trump, not even to really attempt to budget. They just said, all right, we don't care. We'll just go with the CR and then we'll get to something called the big, beautiful bill. But that is not responsible budgeting.
So, Steve, the conventional wisdom used to be is that the party in power takes the blame, right?
Yeah.
Our friends in the Republican Party today don't see it that way. They don't think they're going to take the blame. Any clue of why they're thinking that?
Well, because they're all singing on the same page of, you can just look at a whole litany, and I saw that come out from the White House about it, that it's a clean CR, that we're just trying to do a clean CR, clean CR, clean CR, basically meaning that they didn't add any changes to it. And so I think that's their point. But to Jerry's point, they are in the majority in the Senate, don't have a 60 vote majority. They can't get past a filibuster, which is why, even though they have a majority, they haven't been able to enact the CR. And they have power in the House and they have power in the White House. And I think the public understands that better than the Democrats, that they don't have, that they're withholding their votes. Now, the thing is that, and the other point in this, and I was going to get to this too, is that all they need to do is pick up 5, 6 Democratic votes in the Senate. They don't need to get the whole Democratic caucus to vote with them. They just need to pick up a few people, and they've already picked up a couple, lost one of their own, Senator Paul, but then picked up 3. There are some members who are retiring that, wouldn't have any political blowback. And so really, it does seem to me that it's incumbent on the Republicans at some point to offer some sort of fig leaf. It doesn't have to be the whole healthcare plan, that extension that the Democrats are talking about. It can be something that peels off enough that it gets the package through.
And I do think the Republicans have remarkable unity and a pretty good message on this, that it is this time the Democrats who want something substantive in return for opening the government. The longest shutdown in history, which we've already talked about, it was Trump wanting his border wall, and which was a very, very small thing, but very, very politically charged. And the Democrats were like, no, we agreed to fund this the year before in return for something. You're offering us nothing. Forget it. We're not doing this unless you compromise. But this time, the Democrats are asking for about $1.3 to $1.5 trillion in healthcare finance, along with some other goodies. That's a very big ask for a 4-week continuing resolution.
It is. And the one thing that is, and I agree with you, it has been remarkable unanimity among the Republicans in singing off the same song sheet, with one exception. And that is both OMB Director Vogt, who has been talking about using, and as soon as you start saying, I'm going to use the shutdown to accomplish some sort of policy goal, particularly if it is to essentially lay off or reduction in force federal employees or change the whole budgeting circumstances. And Speaker Johnson has actually said this as well, that this is an opportunity to maybe shrink government. Well, then all of a sudden, it's not just about you just want to pass a clean CR.
And that takes us to a new dimension to this particular shutdown, because even though the last one was, or the last big one was about a wall, now we're talking about firing people. Now we're talking about restructuring the federal government under the executive power while Congress is out because there's a government shutdown. How's that going to play?
Well, I think it's part of a pattern. If you look at the last 40 years of American politics, polarization has broken Congress. Congress can't even do the peristaltic functions of basic governance, let alone solve major national problems, which is what we used to look to them to do. We used to have a Congress that tackled big issues. They can't even keep the lights on. And in that growing failure of an entire institution, executive power has grown. It almost has to. But if we get Trump and his OMB going, this department will be fired 30% and that department will be shut 50%, which we've already seen a bit of it already with AID and VOA and Education Department. But if he does that even more broadly on steroids during the shutdown, we really will have questions about, why do we have a Congress? Like, what is Congress for? Their primary constitutional power is setting the budget. They have the power of the purse, and that's all diminishing.
That's the educational point of view. Steve, what's the practical point of view?
Well, I have to agree with Jerry. One thing is, like, we've talked about it, make appropriators great again, and so that this
you
is
heard
something.
it here, folks. You heard it here first, folks. Make appropriators great again.
I mean, Congress really needs to reassert their control over the power of the purse. And let's face it, I mean, OMB Director Vogt and President Trump are itching for a fight, because one of the things that will happen is that you're going to have, if you do dismiss employees during this time frame, well, that's kind of understandable because they're not really appropriated anyway. There's no money behind them. We're essentially doing all this on credit, if you would, during this time of the shutdown. But as soon as they come back, as soon as a CR passes, well, all of a sudden there's money appropriated for those FTEs, for those full-time equivalent people. That is appropriated funds. And so if the executive is not spending it, well, then they're impounding those funds by extension, which is going to create a tension there, which is under the 1974 Budget Reform and Impoundment Control Act is illegal, which now Director Vogt thinks that's unconstitutional, that law. And so it's going to bring, which passed over President Nixon's veto. So he's not the only person who has sort of that opinion. And so that's going to really come to loggerheads.
But that we're already there. I mean, if you look at what's going to land in the Supreme Court, the cuts at AID, the cuts at education, the cuts at VOA were similar impoundments in a way of just saying, you told us to spend this money, screw you, Congress, we ain't spending it. And so we may already have litigated that by the time the shutdown cases get to, if he does a mass firing during the shutdown, that may already be declared illegal.
So, Steve, I'm teaching a Virginia elections course this semester, and one of my students asked me yesterday, does this shutdown really save us money?
No.
Of course not.
Doesn't save us any money. Yeah.
Explain why.
Well, one is what happens, and Jerry alluded to this earlier, is that we've set all these employees, told them to stay home. It's not even like they can't even volunteer their time if they wanted to. They can't open their laptops. They can't answer their phones. They cannot work, period. So all of a sudden we have this lost work for however many now, just a few days, but it could be longer than that. And obviously in the first Trump administration, it was 35 days that employees weren't doing their job, not because they didn't want to, because they couldn't. And then we pay them for all of that. And there was a law passed in 2019 that essentially required that. And so we're going to be paying these people for work that wasn't done. So, and then the other point is that there's an economic cost. All those employees, they buy coffee, they go out to lunch, they actually, they use their paycheck to do things that are economically important. And it's an important thing for your listeners to know is that more than 80% of the federal workforce isn't in the DC area. It's out all across. So it's going to impact people where you're not even thinking about it. It's not just a Washington problem. It's a national problem. And so what we've seen in previous shutdowns, you go back to like 2013, it was about $1.5 billion a day hit on the economy. And
so it actually costs us money, not just does not save us. The shutdown actually cost us money.
And there's one other way in which it costs us money, and that is a loss of governmental efficiency. And that's that chemotherapy I talked about. The federal government is a workplace, and morale goes down, initiatives fester, and they do less good work in the aftermath of a shutdown, and the problems get bigger during a shutdown. I know the education field pretty well, and there's a lot of government financing of things like science experiments. And sometimes the researchers by law are told, you cannot spend money from a federal grant during the shutdown, which means your lab samples die. Your project is unable. There are cancer patients who will not receive innovative therapies because they were being funded by the federal government.
Interesting. We need to send a copy of this last segment that we just covered in less than 60 seconds to probably half a dozen or half of the members of Congress, because I've heard about half a dozen of them on TV in the last couple of days talking about how this is saving us money. Let's move out a little bit to how do we fix this? Let's go for it. Let's assume in 10 days, this is over. And by the time our listeners are listening to this, it's like, okay, it was a 1 week or 10-day shutdown and it's over. But this is a consistent problem. You said earlier, Steve, not your first rodeo, not the first shutdown. I've been here for 30 some years. I've seen dozens of these. So how do we fix this?
Well, David, I mean, one thing is it's kind of interesting how we got into this mess in the first place. And that was a decision by the Attorney General in the beginning of the Reagan administration that, because we had shutdowns before, it's just everybody went to work and it wasn't really a shutdown. It was just a lapse of funding and you continue to do your work. And then after a few days, the funding would happen and everything would go merrily along. But under the Attorney General, the decision was that no funding means no work. You have to go home and only essential, then it was what they were called, employees can continue to work. So, but here we are. Obviously, that was in 1981, 1982. And
that a decision by my dear friend, Ed Meese?
I don't think it was Ed Meese. I think it was before.
He hadn't gotten confirmed yet. He had those ethical problems.
I see. So, yeah. But so there's this interpretation that now is continued. And then, well, one And it's a kind of a cop out, but I'm at the point where a cop out will, if it works, it works. And that is Senator Lankford, Republican from Oklahoma, Congressman Jody Arrington, Republican from Texas, who's also the House Budget Chair, have a bill that we've supported that would essentially, one, require Congress to stay in the town if there's the case of a shutdown. Two, would just basically have automatic CRs that would kick into place until a long-term CR or the actual appropriations bills are in place. So essentially, a release valve that actually removes some of the incentive for a shutdown, because like I said before, sometimes there have been instances where people want to have the shutdown to have that leverage point. Lawmakers want to have that leverage point, and that would remove that because, we're going to operate under a continuing resolution, which, as we said, is wasteful, but it's better than a shutdown.
Does that have any chance in hell? Is there any traction of getting that out of Congress or heck out of committee?
I think that well, one, I mean, it is the budget committee chair, and it's two Republican lawmakers who are conservative, and so hopefully it has some legs, particularly if you have a shutdown and everybody looks at it as being wasteful and not a good idea. And maybe because it is a good idea, maybe it doesn't have legs.
I actually think this is the first time I'm hearing of it, and I think that it will have legs. I think the Democrats would be fools to not get behind that 100%, because this budget shutdown hurts. Usually in a shutdown or on the eve of a shutdown, it's a hostage situation with the Democrats caring a lot more about the hostage than the Republicans. And that bill will remove the hostage situation to some extent. CRs are bad, but they're not as bad as a shutdown, and I think this would be good. The other thing we could do is go back to another interpretation, right? We could simply have the OLC, the Office of Legal Counsel within the Justice Department, issue a different interpretation. And unless the courts or Congress want to overrule that, that will become the rule of the day. And I think that would be elegant as well.
Interesting. All right. Now that we talked about what is a shutdown, we talked about does it cost or save us money, we talked about possible solutions. Let's take a big picture for a minute here. What is this doing to citizen trust in government?
I think it really hurts it. I think that the average citizen is not going to understand a lot of this terminology. They'll understand, though, that their family went on a vacation to Yellowstone and it was closed, or half of it was closed, or the bathrooms were not open. And there's going to be stress on TSA. What's going to happen with TSA is those people will not be paid, and they'll be expected to work just like air traffic controllers. And those frontline federal workers are going to start seeing sick-ins, i.e. the unions will say, this has happened in prior shutdowns, all right, everybody just start calling in sick in targeted ways, and it is 2 weeks in, this will start to really hurt the American people. The other thing is, Steve already suggested, the federal government is the largest employer in the country. And if you suddenly disemploy that many millions of people, their families will stop spending money. And it can be a very, very large economic impact. So the pain is going to be real.
Steve?
No, I mean, I think Jerry's exactly right in that it is this impact that's going to happen to the public. And it's not just going to Yellowstone. It's also if you got an issue with your taxes, you want to call and find out, talk to the IRS. There's nobody to answer the phone. Already had problems there. There's going to be, as Jerry alluded to, even issues with people's, how their government is performing. And so it is, even though faith in government is really at a low, it can, I guess, go lower. And so certainly there's going to be that their government, their tax dollars are going in and they're not getting the services that they are paying for.
One of the issues that listeners, our students at George Mason, our friends outside of the Mason community face day in and day out are alternative facts today, right? Everybody's hearing a story about this. And I don't want to get into the actual reasons of this particular shutdown, although I can tell you for a fact it's not about funding healthcare for illegal aliens. That's not the case. But putting that aside and putting this shutdown aside, I assume you at Common Sense, Taxpayer for Common Sense, will have some sort of a fact-checked place for our listeners to go to, Steve?
Yeah, absolutely. Your listeners can go visit us at taxpayer.net, our website, and we have 5 fast facts about the shutdown, or just about shutdowns, including that they don't save money. We have a longer issue brief on that. And then also we do a weekly wastebasket, which is an email missive that people can sign up for. And there, each week we kind of discuss what should be the topic. And it's like last week was about the shutdown. This week is about the shutdown. A little bit different. This week, we kind of concentrate on this potential firing of employees that's been talked about. Last week, it was really a little bit more about the this pocket rescission issue that we can talk about if you want to, but still hitting on the shutdown because that is the biggest news as a budget watchdog.
We do have a couple more minutes. Please tell us about that decision.
Sure. So rescissions was also created in the 1974 Budget Act, and it was basically instead of impoundments, they said that the president could submit a list of provisions that they wanted to strike from that year's appropriation, and so it's almost like giving Congress a do-over, and they had 45 days to vote on that. Now, under the current law, if you don't vote at all, then the money has to be spent. So they can only withhold it for 45 days. Earlier this summer, Congress did pass a rescission package for about $9 billion. And so that money was mostly foreign aid was pulled. And then, but Director Vogt noticed a hole in that, which is if you send the package to Congress within that 45-day window, or when that 45-day window extends beyond the fiscal year, well, then you're impounding those funds. If Congress doesn't vote, which the Republicans in the House and the Senate didn't vote, well, then you've just wiped away that money. And that was a decision. The Supreme Court has said that can stand. I don't really know before they do a final ruling. I don't really know how, once it's the end of the fiscal year, the money's gone. They didn't spend it. I don't really know how you remedy that anyway. But that was what a pocket rescission is, sort of like a pocket veto is what the term.
And this is important because it spoiled any sense of goodwill. What the Democrats did in March is Schumer got together some other moderate senators and said, we have to keep the lights on because if we don't, Trump will have such power, OMB will have such power, he might start firing people at will and shutting down agencies. We can't let him do that. And Schumer got a lot of grief from the base of the Democratic Party. He looked like he was helping Trump. And in the months since, Trump shut down agencies, fired people en masse, did lots of the things that they were hoping to prevent. And that plus the rescission left the Democrats with thinking like, what else can you do to us if we shut down the government? How bad can it be? And so the Democrats have their base on their side. I think Steve was exactly right when he said, what's going to end this is when one side feels the blame so much and is feeling the pain so much that they just can't take it anymore. And I don't know which side that is going to be.
Time will tell. Conventional wisdom is the party in power. In this case, it would be the Republicans. But there's a case here that it could be the other side that takes the blame, or both of them take it equally. Steve, just to put this into context for our listeners, the $9 billion in that rescission package, that is a rounding error, right? We're spending $2 trillion a month in this government, aren't we?
Well, yeah, it's a $7 trillion federal budget, basically, and so it's even less than a rounding error. So it isn't much in the way of savings, and a lot of it is just optics.
All right. Any final thoughts, gentlemen?
Well, I actually think that we are going to have to fix the budget process because what this actually reflects is a total breakdown of the 74 reforms. The idea that Congress would set a budget target and then divide it into the various appropriations committees and then come forward with a budget in response to the president's budget. This system has barely worked in good times and it is not at all functional now. And I think we should start with a blank sheet of paper and envision a better budget process that deals with weird things like the gap between appropriation and authorization, but also the political reality that we are just so polarized.
I'm a former state legislator, so I can tell you, Jerry, that the solution to that is simple. It's a balanced budget amendment. States live within their means. They have to balance their budget. and they have to have a budget. And it may be time for another amendment to our Constitution. Steve, the last word is yours.
Thanks. Well, just to Jerry's point, so since the 1974 reforms, the actual appropriations bills have only been done on time before the beginning of the fiscal year 4 times. So more than 50 years, it's only happened 4 times. And the last time that they were done, the last time it happened was in 1997. And the last time they did them individually, so each individual appropriations bill passed on its own, was in 1994. So clearly things are broken. And I don't think we can wait until we get an amendment to the Constitution. That will take a while. And I think that it's really about figuring out better processes and moving forward and getting people to work together. But it's certainly completely broken down, and it's not something that is sustainable in the long run.
And to David's point, the last time the budget was balanced was 1998. So that's been a while too.
Yep. Gentlemen, I thank you both. Steve, thank you for your insights. Jerry, for co-hosting and your academic explanation of some of what we're dealing with here. I'd like to take a second to reiterate the Schar School's commitment to public dialogue on policy and governance, not just politics. We try our best to keep this apolitical. Listeners, to learn more about our guest today or about the Schar School's programs, please visit us on the web at shar.gmu.edu/podcast. See you on the next episode.
That brings us to the end of another insightful episode of Policy and Governance Perspectives. We truly appreciate you joining us for these important discussions featuring voices from across the Schar School. For more information and to explore our archive of past episodes, please visit shar.gmu.edu/podcast. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to sharing more with you next time.